Good afternoon. My name is Harry Attridge, chairman this year of the Dwight H. Lectureship Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special celebration. The Terry Lectureship was established about a century ago by a gift from Dwight Harrington Terry of Bridgeport, Connecticut, to endow a series of lectures on religion and its application to human welfare in the light of scientific knowledge and philosophical insights. These lectures have produced a long series of distinguished books published by Yale University Press. And to celebrate that long and distinguished history, we decided this year to have a very special celebration with 5 distinguished lecturers and a panel which is going to be chaired by Margaret Warner, newly on the Yale Corporation. So we welcome you to this series. This is an interactive event. And if you have questions or issues that you would like to raise with our lecturers, you may do so through the Yale website, www.yale.edu/terrylecture. The format today will be a series of lectures followed by questions and answers. We will take a brief break at 3:30 and be back for the second lecture of the afternoon at 4. We will conclude promptly in time for us to leave this room by 5:30 this evening for a reception upstairs in room 208. We need to leave because there is a special screening in this room this evening, and the room has to be cleared at that time. At this point, to introduce our first lecturer, I'd like to call on my colleague in religious studies and sociology, Phil Gorski, who works on the very timely issue of religion and politics. Phil.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to introduce Robert Wuthnow, who is professor of sociology and chair of the sociology department at Princeton University. And I think it would be fair to say that he is the most prominent sociologist of religion working in the United States today. I'd add that he's also one of the most prolific. He's written dozens of books, edited dozens more, and written scores and scores of articles. In fact, one of my colleagues once quipped to me that she was going to have to stop reading all the things that Bob was writing so that she could get some of her own writing done. I wouldn't recommend that because I think there are a few people in the United States today who have their pulse on American religious life the way that Professor Wuthnow does. He's worked on a wide number of topics, including relations between evangelicals and liberals, popular religion and spirituality, the role of arts and music in contemporary Christianity, just to name a few. And today he is going to start us off in our dialogue about religion and science.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's impressive when you think about it that the Terry Lectures began about 100 years ago, and that the conflict that we think about between religion and science is still as important as it was way back then. Today, to start us off, I want to take a rather unorthodox approach to this topic. I'm going to focus on those folks who see no conflict between religion and science. And just to give you a brief preview of where I'm going with this, I'm going to spend the first part of my lecture trying to explain some of the reasons why there should be conflict between religion and science, and then discuss some of the reasons why there isn't more conflict than there is. So as has been announced, my topic is No Contradictions Here, Science, Religion, and the Culture of All Reasonable Possibilities. In seeking perspective on recent controversies about religion and science, one can hardly do better than the wisdom provided by that Bible of guidance and revelation for academics, the New York Times. In its coverage of litigation about the teaching of intelligent design and of school board decisions about evolution and of policy debates about stem cell research and genetic engineering, the nation's favorite arbiter of elite opinion has documented beyond doubt that questions about the respective roles of science and religion remain of great public interest. It is this public interest, or more precisely, the cultural role of these controversies on which I wish to focus. What fascinates me about the New York Times coverage is not its reportage or even its editorials, but the letters it chooses to print from its readers. Unsurprisingly, many of the letters speak in favor of science, while others side clearly with religion. The former variously associate science with hard evidence, discovery, and progressive thinking, in contrast with the ludicrous, disheartening, and even dangerous claims of religious ideologues. The latter question whether scientific facts are as firmly established as scientists claim and worry about the moral implications of science. A few accuse scientists of promoting an agenda of unfettered atheism, but far more interesting are the letters that seek to reconcile science and religion. For example, a reader from Minneapolis writes, "In my view, there is no contradiction between evolution and religion. One explains how and the other explains why." A scientist in Los Angeles observes, "Science is a tool for furthering human understanding of the natural world, and as such can coexist with religion." A reader in New Jersey elaborates, "Science is about the natural, material world. Religion is about the supernatural and spiritual. Science operates mainly with numbers, religion with words." And this reader concludes, "In short, they are separate but equal." While these readers are the voices of reason, the defenders of a middle ground, threatened as much by the simplistic proponents of science as by the radical claims of religious extremists. Theirs is a both-and rather than an either-or world, and they are in distinguished company. They stand with Albert Einstein, who famously remarked, "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind." And with Stephen Jay Gould, who has argued that science tells us what the universe is made of, while religion deals with ultimate meaning and moral value. They rise above the fray, so to speak, refusing to opt for the predefined positions presented to them, instead preferring to question the very terms in which the debate has been cast. They are what we train our students at Yale and Princeton to be. They are capable of seeing both sides of an argument, of parsing what at first appear to be irreconcilable views, and thus transforming black and white into shades of gray. Their approach is so attractive, so thoroughly educated, and so reassuringly American. It has not been popular, at least in my discipline in sociology, for scholars to be interested in studying people who espouse a language of moderation and reason. That language is too much our own to feel comfortable examining it critically. The popular tactic is to start from the supposition that proponents on the religious side of these and most other arguments are so downright strange as to deserve most of our attention. Thus, we dig a bit and find that they are really expressing some economic or political grievance, that they are too dumb to recognize themselves, or worse, are being led astray by clever political operatives or self-aggrandizing religious leaders. For instance, in his book, What's the Matter with Kansas?, Thomas Frank, a native of that state who fled to the big time in Chicago, argues that Kansans vote Republican because they are obsessed with keeping evolution out of their schools and putting prayer back in, whereas voting Democrat would be better for their state's economy. Jayhawkers are bargaining away the chance to give their children a better future, he says, by focusing more attention on moral battles than on good jobs and better schools. Thomas Frank is perhaps not the best example of serious scholarship, since his book is candidly autobiographical and impressionistic. Yet it is worth noting that his work has been warmly embraced in the social science community. A more thoroughly academic example can be found in the work of sociologist Amy Binder, whose book Contentious Curricula examines creationist controversies. Binder argues that creationists are cleverer than the naive reader may have supposed. Leaders frame, a technical sociological term here, leaders frame appeals in religious terms when speaking to church groups, but downplay this rhetoric when talking to the media or in the courts. They strategize and mobilize against school boards rather than against larger governing bodies because it takes fewer resources to do so. It helps, she says, when they win elections to these boards. It hurts when school administrators muscle creationists aside with assertions about separation of church and state. It's understandable that scholars focus on what they perceive as deviant behavior. The very idea of a few citizens in out-of-the-way places like Kansas or Dover, Pennsylvania, promoting strange ideas sends journalists and social scientists scurrying to study this quaint phenomenon. It is as if the Amish suddenly ran a candidate for president. What would the world be like if these creationists, whom their own neighbors describe as the laughingstock of the world, succeeded in eliminating science from the curriculum? Perhaps there is something to be learned here about the peculiarities of American culture, just as there is from studying serial killers. If the goal is to understand American culture, it would nevertheless seem strange to focus on the periphery and neglect the center. The both-and position expressed in thoughtful letters to the editor is held by a large share of the American public. In opinion polls, this middle ground is favored by a majority or large minority of the public, depending on the wording of specific questions. For instance, a CBS News survey conducted in 2005 found that 67% of the public believes it is possible to believe in both God and both God and evolution, while only 29% thought this was not possible. The sheer reasonableness of the both-and approach, though, necessarily raises two interesting puzzles. First, why is it that science and religion appear to be in conflict at all? Is it that the antagonists who perpetrate these struggles are less reasonable than everybody else? Is it perhaps true that they are simply duped by their leaders? If it is so sensible to argue that science and religion are simply different, would it not be more likely that conflict between the two would be non-existent? Pursuing these questions will provide a way of examining afresh why religion and science might not be so easily reconciled even for reasonable people. Once we have considered these possibilities, though, a different puzzle arises. Why are the conflicts between science and religion as infrequent as they are? This question will take us into the larger terrain of contemporary culture, where we can view the assumptions that undergird our conviction that reasonable people can simply resolve their differences if they bring enough gray matter to the table. A useful place to begin is the idea commonly known in sociological theory as institutional differentiation. The idea of institutional differentiation, simply put, is that the various spheres of social life are more distinct and specialized now than they probably were in earlier times when societies were smaller and less complex. For instance, Max Weber argued that one of the important preconditions for the rise of modern capitalism was the separation of paid labor from the household. This separation of spheres, Weber suggested, made it possible for labor to be governed with greater attention to rewarding productivity than was the case when workers were also family members. The emergence of modern science in 17th century Europe is typically regarded as another example of institutional differentiation. Although its rise may have been facilitated by religion, science then became an autonomous sphere, capable of setting its own agenda and determining for itself what activities are worth pursuing. If science and religion are distinct institutions, then this is further reason to believe that potential conflict can be overcome by recognizing their differences. These are not merely conceptual differences, such as one of emphasizing the natural or supernatural, but also of social arrangements themselves. In the simplest case, scientific academies do science, and religious organizations do religion. Scientists do not preach, and preachers are ill-suited to conduct scientific research. Of course, it might be objected that greater specialization requires greater interaction across spheres, a point that Emil Durkheim emphasized in describing the organic solidarity that arises from people with different occupations becoming interdependent. But that argument needs to be pushed further. A baker and a butcher might be mutually dependent, but it's less clear that science and religion bear the same relationship to one another. A better analogy would be two all-purpose delis, one specializing in bread and the other in meat, but both of them seeking to expand. Science and religion come into conflict because neither one stays neatly in its respective sphere. As Gilly S. Drury and his co-authors observe in their recent empirical study of the global expansion of science as a cultural form, and I quote, "A reasonable way to interpret the long history of conflict between scientific and religious models is to see these institutions as competing on the same ground, rather than operating in different domains. As science has grown, its autonomy has been compromised by the very fact that it influences more aspects of social life and in turn is dependent on a wider array of social, economic, and political resources. The patronage that supported Kepler's observatory in Denmark, or Galileo's research in Italy, or the Royal Society in London, and the French Academy of Sciences in Paris, came from royal coffers, or from the Medici, and from other wealthy individuals, such as the Dukes of Savoy and Tuscany. Only much later did governments require average citizens to support science through taxes and to expose their children to science in public schools. The advance of science was an act not only of intellectual achievement, but also of political displacement. The three estates of the realm, wrote Don K. Price in his memorable account of this transition, were the clergy, the nobility, and the burgesses. The privileges of all three were abolished. But now, Price observed, the results of scientific advance have been to require federal support of education and the appropriation of a tithe of the federal budget for research and development. The idea that science merely describes the natural world, leaving questions about purpose and worth to religion, is simply untrue. The sharp rise in developing nations' initiation of government-sponsored science ministries and participation in international scientific organizations illustrates the extent to which being modern and progressive require at least a symbolic commitment to science. Being an educated person does not require knowing anything about religion, but it does involve taking courses in science, passing examinations, testing one's familiarity with scientific thinking, and being respectful towards science in one's work and, of course, at parties. In these ways, science shapes the cultural norms that serve as standards of self-worth. Personal identity is deeply influenced in other ways by scientific discoveries. The meaning of human personhood is profoundly shaped by how humanity itself is located in an evolutionary chain, or in an expanding view of nearly infinite galaxies. For its part, religion may appear in many instances to be in retreat, but it too expands periodically out of its earlier domain. The role of Darwinism in the rise of late 19th century Protestant fundamentalism is a commonly cited example. Fundamentalism was as surely an attempt to be scientific as it was an effort to resist science. Millenarian predictions about the fulfillment of biblical prophecies gained popularity as these arguments relied more heavily on numeric calculations and new certainties about the orderly progression of time. During the 1950s, religious organizations drew significantly from the social sciences, especially from psychology, and from the expanding mental health movement as they developed new and more highly specialized programs of pastoral counseling. The more recent emergence of creation science, as it's called, and of arguments about intelligent design, borrowing as they do from scientific studies and from critical discussions within the scientific literature, could be considered another such example. The interaction that results when science and religion expand into each other's turf is more complex even than this image of competition implies, because the boundaries defining the two spheres are themselves matters of negotiation. What Thomas F. Guerin, a sociologist, calls boundary work consists of scientists' ongoing efforts to create a favorable public image for science by contrasting it favorably to non-scientific intellectual or technical activities. In Victorian England, for instance, Giron notes that scientists publicly ridiculed church leaders who prayed for God's intervention after the cholera epidemic of 1866, and they denounced prayer as a form of superstition and charged the church with standing in the way of scientific progress. Giron suggests that religion bashing actually served scientists well, meaning that in a convoluted way, religion as an enemy of science is also its friend. Rather than depicting religion as something different from science but useful in its own way, scientists characterized it as pseudoscience based on false empirical claims. That such uses of religion by scientists continue is readily apparent. Writing in the New York Times, evolutionary biologist Olivia Judson argued recently that an understanding of evolution was vital to guarding against a flu pandemic, and, in her words, saving the lives of tens of millions of people. By implication, religionists themselves might be responsible if a flu pandemic did occur. Let's not strip evolution from the textbooks, she wrote, or banish it from the class, or replace it with ideologies born of wishful thinking. If we do, we might find ourselves facing the consequences of natural selection. Boundary work suggests conscious and even malicious manipulation at times of the turf wars between religion and science. It is also the case, though, that boundary questions become important because definitions of religion and of science are themselves subjects of cultural construction. For instance, popular assertions about religion typically assume that it is readily defined by belief in God, or resort in some other way to arguments about the supernatural. Yet scholars of religion seldom define it in those terms. Clifford Geertz's well-worn definition of religion, for example, refers neither to God nor to the supernatural, but emphasizes symbols, powerful and long-lasting motivations, and conceptions of a general order of existence clothed in an aura of factuality. Would that definition not apply equally to some understandings of science? Lest it be assumed that religion is somehow unique in being subject to such definitional ambiguities, it is worth noting that science, too, has come under scrutiny for the same reasons. What counts as scientific fact is by no means dictated only by nature itself. Scientific activity is not about nature, Bruno Latour and Steve Wolgar write in their influential ethnographic study of laboratory life. It is a fierce fight to construct reality, they say. They do not mean that scientists falsify their observations or that they fabricate reality from thin air. They do show through numerous examples how scientific conclusions are influenced by the availability or unavailability of instruments, how powerful teams impose standards that may reduce the ability of other teams to compete, and how tentative statements preclude the possibility of pursuing other reasonable lines of investigation. The upshot of these examples is that neither science nor religion can be quite as easily compartmentalized into separate and non-competing domains as our both-and commentators want to believe. It is the case that ambiguous conceptual categories can be the starting place for more nuanced arguments about similarities and differences. However, the more relevant point is that ambiguity also opens the door for continuing conflict. It is simply impossible to look back at some historic event and conclude that the debate between religion and science was finally resolved at that point. As long as the two have fuzzy edges, proponents, antagonists, and bystanders in the general public will be able to contest where one domain should end and the other begin. The likelihood of such contestation increases, as I have suggested, because religion and science are never static. Indeed, both struggle to assert themselves as legitimate ways of addressing important issues and thus as legitimate claimants of social resources. Now, there's another source of conflict that I will introduce by mentioning briefly something from Paul Ricoeur. You may remember that Paul Ricoeur wrote about what he called a hermeneutics of suspicion. And in his framing, that was usually associated with a critique of religion such as one finds in Marx or Nietzsche or Freud. And Ricoeur argued that these masters of suspicion, as he called them, unveiled the illusory character of religion by showing that it concealed political and economic interests. To see reality clearly, Ricoeur argued one needed to unmask the false perceptions of religion. At least these masters of suspicion argued that. But an interesting thing has happened in our time. It might be argued now that this same skeptical attitude toward religion has also extended toward science. Power and privilege most certainly lie with the scientific estate as much today as they did with religion in the past. The high esteem in which the public holds scientists and science, if polls are believed, is tempered with the populist ambivalence that colors public attitudes toward all elites. Admiration bleeds easily into envy and further into disdain. If a segment of the religious community stands ready to battle science over evolution and genetic engineering, this broader hermeneutics of suspicion toward science is almost certainly a predisposing factor. Science is sometimes popularly regarded as the great savior, bringing hope for conquering illnesses and inventing labor-saving technology. But its image has also been tarnished. Critical discussions of science seldom pass up the opportunity to connect it with the development of the atomic bomb. In medical research, the infamous Tuskegee experiment, in which some 400 poor black men were never told they had syphilis and never treated for it, all in the name of research. That's often mentioned as well. Environmental concerns have also affected public perceptions of science. Ever since the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the 1960s, former NSF Director Richard Atkinson recalls, there was a growing feeling abroad that the purity of science was not quite as pure as it had seemed. An additional factor that aggravates the potential conflict between religion and science is that relatively few scientists are religious, at least in conventional ways. For instance, in a recent national survey of physicists, chemists, and biologists at elite research universities, only 8% said they had no doubts about God's existence, while 38% said they did not believe in God at all, and another 29% said they did not know if there is a God and believed there was no way to find out. In the same survey, 55% said they had no religious affiliation, while only 16% attended religious services even as often as once a month. These figures underscore the sharp differences that exist between scientists and the general public, where, for instance, only 7% can be regarded as atheists or agnostics. If the public imagines that scientists' personal views influence their scholarship, then perceptions of conflict between religion and science would not be surprising. A further confounding aspect of the relationship between religion and science is what is sometimes referred to as the hubris of science. Having considered Einstein's remark about the complementarities of religion and science earlier, we need also to recall Abraham Heschel's rejoinder. Heschel said, "Hubris is the tragic sin of our time. It is the conviction that there exist only laws of nature and technology." Heschel's view is currently echoed in internet blogs, where this perception of science surfaces freely. One blogger writes, "I'm skeptical of scientists and technologists designing animals or genes or drugs or anything else that nature already does perfectly." In this blogger's view, scientists are drunk on hubris, in it for the money or their own glory, and sadly incapable of any humility. A less emotionally tinged argument emerges in the writing of Annie Dillard, the prize-winning author of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, a book that was widely praised for its extraordinary sensitivity to the complexity of the natural world. In her more recent book, For the Time Being, Dillard adds a more explicitly theological, cultural, and historical dimension to her reflections, noting that our time has produced many scientific advances, such as antibiotics, silicon chips, men on the moon, and spliced genes. Dillard asks, "Are not our heightened times the important ones?" She might have added that after eons of evolution, suddenly we, through the explorations of science, are now the first ever to have grasped that process. Surely science has taught us so much in the last century that we could not possibly be wrong about what we know. Do we not therefore have good reason to think that our time is especially significant? Her answer: these times of ours are ordinary times, a slice of life like any other. And she asked, who can bear to hear this, or who will consider it? Perceptions of scientific hubris remind us that cultural disputes with science are by no means limited to those involving religion. The two cultures that C.P. Snow described in the 1950s were not science and religion, but science and the humanities, or more specifically, literary intellectuals. Snow is generally interpreted as having argued for greater interaction between science and the humanities, thus being a supporter of the both-and view, but his remarks about science also convey understated criticism. The scientific culture, he wrote, is expansive, not restrictive, confident at the roots, the more confident after its bout of Oppenheimerian self-criticism, certain that history is on its side, impatient, intolerant. Snow's concerns continue to be voiced in larger criticisms about the moral fragmentation of a culture in which the can-do attitude of science presumably overwhelms questions about deeper values. Noting contemporary society's assumption that every problem facing mankind is susceptible to technological intervention and control, Roger Kimball writes, for instance, that, quote, the temptation to reduce culture to a reservoir of titillating pastimes is all but irresistible. In this critique, science is not so much the only source of cultural deterioration, but is seen as a contributor to the malaise that includes drugs, violence, promiscuity, and an insatiable desire for gratification. So those are some of the reasons why the conflict between science and religion might be expected. And having considered those, let me now turn to the second question. With such potential for conflict, why is it that the actual skirmishes between science and religion have been relatively rare? Why is it that among the more than 14,000 school districts in the United States, only a few have become involved in litigation about evolution and intelligent design? With such a large number of religious organizations and so many people in the United States who believe in God and, for that matter, in creationism, would it not have been reasonable to expect a great deal more conflict with science than there has been? What accounts for the fact that most Americans seem content to believe that there are no contradictions between science and religion? This capacity to look at the world in both and terms is, in my view, the telling feature of American culture, not the occasional fisticuffs between religionists and scientists. Let us acknowledge that the ease with which we reconcile seemingly opposing points of view may well be rooted in something more pervasive than American culture itself. Public opinion researchers have long recognized that people give inconsistent responses in surveys without feeling a need to reconcile the apparent contradictions. Anthropologists have long argued that one of the central features of tribal rituals is their capacity to hold in tension two seemingly opposing beliefs or practices. Cognitive dissonance theory, though no longer as uncritically accepted among psychologists as it once was, asserts that people adjust their beliefs when asked to perform tasks that deviate from their values. The common thread in all of that research is that the mind is malleable and finds ways to create order or to escape having to create order when tension arises. Yet the point I want to make is not that people reconcile themselves to seemingly contradictory beliefs or statements about the world, but how they do this. How do they do this? The capacity to create consistency may be cognitively available, but the manner in which this order-imposing process is carried out is cultural. In the case of both and views about science and religion, resolution does not come by adjusting one's views to be more compatible with science or with religion, nor does it involve simply keeping the two apart. The cultural work involved is more complex, and although it includes specific ideas about religion and science, it is also associated with broader ways in which our culture enables us to minimize conflict. Culture is above all language, and language provides the first means of dealing with apparent contradictions. An example that I have examined in some detail in another context is the discursive negotiation of the tension in American culture between individualism on the one hand and altruism on the other hand. The two are not mirror opposites any more than science and religion are, but they do run in opposing directions. Individualism connotes looking out for one's self-interest, whereas altruism means putting another's needs ahead of one's own. But American culture manages to emphasize both. How does it do that? Well, in personal interviews, altruists who are also individualistic manage the potential conflict by employing a number of discursive devices, one of the most common of which is multivocality, literally speaking through the voice of different characters within the space of a few sentences. For instance, a person might say, "I help at the soup kitchen one night a week, and people there tell me, 'You are really a kind-hearted person.' But I say, 'No, not really. I get a lot out of being here. I have to admit, though, sometimes I'd rather stay home and relax.'" That's almost exactly a kind of quote that I've heard a number of times in real-life interviews. Although these remarks are all uttered by one person, the different voices involved permit the complexity of the issues to be displayed. The speaker at once affirms that she does engage in helping behavior, yes, and is perceived by others as being altruistic, but then she immediately denies being purely altruistic, even while acknowledging that, yes, she is also making a sacrifice. A multivocal statement like this seems so effortless that the conditions making it possible can easily be missed. The fact of having had an exchange at a soup kitchen is less important than regarding the use of it as a legitimate response to a question like that. The exchange substitutes for taking a single position on whether one is individualistic or altruistic. It depends on a certain level of flexibility or even decoupling of the various components of one's self, what psychologist Kenneth Gergen calls multiphrenia, or the splitting of the individual into a multiplicity of self-investments. A multiphrenic person does not say, as Martin Luther did, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Instead, there is a separation of roles and of facets of the self to the point that one can imagine taking several different positions on a topic and then engaging in a kind of internal conversation among the proponents of those different views that one holds. It becomes possible to say, for instance, "I heard that Albert Einstein thought it was possible to believe in God and to be a scientist, so I suppose if I thought about it more, I might come to the same conclusion, although you could probably persuade me otherwise if we talked long enough." In this respect, multiphrenia means not only being able to see different sides of an argument, but actually being incapable of arriving at a firm judgment of one's own. Well, real-life examples of multivocality in dealing with questions about science and religion are not hard to find. On October 24, 2005, the U.S. District Court transcript in Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District, much publicized case that we're going to be hearing more about in these lectures today and tomorrow, a case in which the plaintiffs in Dover, Pennsylvania, and the school board, they sued the school board for requiring that criticisms of evolution based on ideas of intelligent design be incorporated into the curriculum. That transcript included the following exchange between the plaintiff's attorney, Mr. Walczak, and Professor Stephen Fuller, one of a number of expert witnesses. This one happened to be a sociologist, that's why I decided to pick on him. He was an expert witness on behalf of the defense. So here's the question from the attorney. Mr. Rothschild asked you, "A theory is not going to graduate into a fact, right?" And the answer was, "Right, exactly. No, I mean, I do think there is, but the tone of the statement is a little confusing. So I'm agreeing with Miller." Miller was another witness on that point. Now, the lawyer's question is wordy and interesting enough, but listen to the response. It's from Fuller. But what I'm agreeing with Miller on is I can understand why he sort of sees it that way. I wasn't necessarily saying that I had some definitive view about what the statement meant, but rather that I was sympathetic to, I could see where he was coming from in finding this problematic. And although the attorney persisted in attempting to determine whether Fuller regarded evolution as theory, fact, or some combination of the two, Fuller continued to insist that he was merely thinking through the issue and naturally could see it from all different angles. A dispersed self, or a multiphrenic self, that incorporates different voices provides a discursive mechanism for reconciling religion and science. But in addition, the normative emphasis in our society on tolerance provides a strong warrant for doing so. Alan Wolfe, in his book One Nation After All, argues that middle-class Americans are remarkably generous toward others who may have profound differences of belief. So generous, in fact, that they are likely to say, "Oh, neat, that's a cool view. I'm glad you said that." Wolfe's argument is especially relevant to this question of conflict between religion and science because he concludes that the so-called culture war, which pits fundamentalists against those with more enlightened views, does not characterize the majority of Americans. Instead, the prevailing view, he says, is that we may have our differences, but we feel, we should abide by the law and we should respect all points of view. Wolfe has been interpreted as suggesting that America consists largely of a muddled middle, flanked by extremists on the right and left. That rendering, though, misses the subtlety of middle American culture. Not only are diverse opinions tolerated, there's also a kind of tentativeness, even cynicism about truth. A person has difficulty holding fast to a conviction because it is no longer possible to know what is true. If this argument is correct, the both-and position on science and religion is less a statement about how the two are complementary and more a way of expressing uncertainty about what either claims to provide. For instance, in arguing that science describes nature while religion deals with questions of meaning and value, a person can, in effect, point to the limitations of both science and religion. Descriptions of nature are incomplete, disappointing, even meaningless, and yet the big questions that religion tries to answer may also be elusive. Thus, concerns about the hubris of science do not take shape as convictions about religion, but as unanswered questions about the worth of scientific knowledge. And similarly, doubts about religion remain as uncertainties rather than then translating into a devout faith in science on the other side. In all of this, understandings of religion and science necessarily change. Both become more highly personalized, although in different ways. When people associate religion with why questions, words, the supernatural, and the spiritual, they do not mean that the biblical account of creation should be taken literally or that Vatican teachings about God are authoritative. They mean instead that religion helps them find meaning in life, gives them words to utter when they feel despondent, and connects them with some larger dimension of life than the one they experience with their senses. Spirituality is not so much expressed in a creedal statement handed down from theologians, but it's their view about what they might imagine the sacred to be like. Spirituality can thus remain popular in circles where participation in organized religion has become infrequent. For instance, in the survey showing hardly any scientists attending worship services, 2/3 nevertheless said they were spiritual, and more than a third regarded themselves as very or moderately spiritual. The personalization of spirituality is associated with broader characteristics of American religion, ones that I've described elsewhere as a kind of grassroots theology that focuses a lot on autobiographical narratives and that emphasize spiritual journeys and tinkering and negotiation. Spiritual seekers are not uncommitted to their quest for the sacred. Indeed, they often take it quite seriously. They nevertheless find answers in multiple venues picking and choosing what they consider personally meaningful, rather than feeling a need to accept entire traditions or universal truths. And two other features of contemporary understandings of religion contribute to the ease with which many Americans reconcile it with science. One is the idea that God is ultimately a mystery, meaning that all teachings about God are at best flawed or incapable of authoritative interpretations. This view diminishes the significance of creeds and amplifies the importance of personal experience. It permits believing that God created the universe without implying that one knows how this may have happened or even what exactly that divine force may have been. The other is that the meaning of sacred texts necessarily changes as well. Although the Bible may be regarded as a source of divine truth, its words are less likely to be accepted as literal truth, and even among those who do regard it this way, the idea that it is free of errors becomes less important than just the fact that it's a source of guidance and comfort. Being able to relativize arguments by defining their significance strictly in personal terms sometimes occurs when people talk about science as well. A thoughtful young man named Steve, who participated in a recent national study of teenagers, worried that evolution emphasizes self-preservation, which in turn could conflict in his mind with universalistic religious notions of morality. But he did not worry very deeply about this potential conflict, he said, because the ideas were, in his words, just fun to think about, kind of interesting, because I don't really let it bother me. And he tempers his own views about morality and rationality by saying, let each person decide for themselves. Personalization in science more often takes a different form than it does in religion, however. It is less a matter of assuming that science consists of private beliefs than of believing that its purpose is to bless all of us with personal goods. In a survey conducted for the National Science Foundation, for instance, 86% of Americans agreed that science and technology are making our lives healthier, easier, and more comfortable. Science is, in this sense, pragmatic. From day to day, it matters less whether science reveals how life evolved than that it yields vaccines and new pharmaceuticals. Knowing that humans share a high proportion of genetic material with other primates is for most people a matter of idle curiosity. It's a thought we are willing to entertain as long as genetic research provides answers to riddles about birth defects and disease. So to conclude, laments about the continuing conflicts between science and religion, I've suggested, are less interesting than the fact that most people perceive no contradictions between the two. To be sure, many find it worrisome when fundamentalists seek to define religious arguments as science, and people thus consider it laudable when theologians and scientists engage each other in dialogue. However, the value of such dialogue does not lie in eradicating the historic grounds on which the battles between science and religion have been fought. It lies instead in delineating more thoughtfully what each has to offer and how each may influence the other. Interaction of this kind requires scientists and religious leaders to speak beyond their own disciplines and in ways that engage the wider public. Thoughtful discussions of the relationships between religion and science remain rare. Critics of intelligent design and creationism warn appropriately that science classes are not the place for these religious ideas to be introduced. Yet separation of church and state generally discourages schools from including religion in other parts of their curriculum. Meanwhile, religious congregations are unlikely venues for informed discussion because of inadequate time or interest or training in science. Television commentary and newspaper editorials thus become one of the few places in which questions about the relationships between science and religion appear. The reason these discussions are difficult is not because the public is caught up in bitter disputes about what should be taught in science classes, but because the both-and view of science and religion has become so familiar. When the culture tells us that all reasonable possibilities can easily be reconciled, it's time to take another look. Religion, reduced to personal opinion, is diminished nearly beyond recognition, just as science is when creature comforts become the sole reason for studying and supporting it. Distasteful as those school board debates may be, we might give them some credit for articulating contradictions too readily denied. Thank you. Well, if I understand correctly, we have some time for questions, comments. Yes, there are microphones in each aisle, so please use those.
Mary Evelyn Tucker in the Institution for Social and Policy Studies. I appreciated your talk, although I'm not sure that I agree with its conclusion, but I actually wanted to raise a different question, and that is that many of the discussions, I would say almost all, keep the framework of religion and science within what I would really consider Christianity and certain forms of Western science, and that's fine, but it's not defined that way. And I think one of the major problems is that we're usually comparing science with Christianity and, again, fundamentalism, etc. So my major plea here is that the world's religions should be involved, should be included, and there's immense diversity, and in fact, there's larger compatibilities, I would suggest, especially in some of the Asian religions, with science in its modern forms. So I would just like to invite some reflection on that.
And that's a point that's very well taken, so I appreciate you raising it here. In fact, to add a footnote to your point about the importance of world religions, one of the things that's probably going on here in the seeming resurgence or upsurgence of fundamentalist Christian voices is that they feel not only threatened by science, but threatened by the increased religious diversity of our society. Something I've looked at in other contexts, but people who believe, for instance, that only Christianity, or indeed only their version of Christianity, is true or the right way, or however they may frame it, are very worried about Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus, or for that matter, immigrants of all kinds, or just the increasing diversity of the society. So there may be in this conflict between religion, quote unquote, and science, a subtext about some of these other cultural changes that are going on. Yes?
Yeah, I'm Richard Prum, professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. I had two comments that might prompt responses. First, I wondered, I saw in your description of the multivocal middle, perhaps a scientific and religious commonality. Could we call these people the truth matters minority? And how would you respond to that? And then secondly, I wonder about the flip side of characterizing scientists as not being religious. Why are so few religious people going into the sciences?
Right.
And maybe you could comment on those. Thanks.
Right, yeah. Well, your first point is an interesting one about these people who are multivocal in the middle. In the longer version of this, what I try to do is suggest that there is kind of both good news and bad news in that category in the middle. The good news being, well, yes, if we think of ourselves in liberal education circles as encouraging people to think and see multiple points of view and everything, well, that's precisely what we're encouraging them to do. And so we should be glad. The bad news in that it is happening so easily and so quickly that it's shutting off thought and shutting off further conversation or further engaged dialogue, because we just spin off a kind of easy statement about, oh, well, part of me thinks this, part of me thinks that, and end of discussion. Okay, remind me of your second one. I always forget the second one. Why so few go into, right, why does, well, that's actually an interesting question. One would assume, I guess, from the surveys, this particular study that I mentioned among scientists where so few are religious, that also means that they were raised non-religious, or we could assume from those studies that apparently people who are quite religious aren't going into science. But I don't know that we actually have evidence to suggest that that's the case from the broad population, because what one would then have to do is, track people over time, say from grade school through high school or whatever, from lots of different backgrounds, and see if there's some disproportionate number of, say, the non-religious who become scientists and fewer of the religionists. I mean, that's a reasonable assumption. It's one that has often been made in these discussions about the teaching of intelligent design in the schools. You'll see again some of these favorite letter writers to the New York Times saying, well, nobody from Kansas is ever going to become a scientist if that happens. Well, I can think of lots of reasons why people from Kansas might not become scientists, but I doubt if that's one of the big ones.
I taught at KU for 12 years.
I graduated from KU, so we're we're together on that one. But it's an important question. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm a first-year graduate student. My question, actually, two questions. I was struck, and forgive me if I don't quote you exactly, I was struck by your thought that words were more the province of religion, numbers of science, especially later when you mentioned that language and culture are so intimately connected. And I think of science as a huge part of culture, and also that religion can benefit from numbers and does, and science definitely, to me, is an intimate connection with words. And I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that struck me too. That was in one of those quotes from a letter to the New York Times where that person said that. And again, that's a kind of easy assumption to make where one says, well, we've got, let's say, literature, we've got religious texts on the one side, and surely those are composed of words, whereas science, well, that must be all numbers, it's all math, and so forth. That, again, is an example, mostly in my mind, of the quick and easy way to find a both-and view. Because, I mean, I suspect even that person, had they been writing a tome rather than a short letter to the New York Times, would have recognized that, well, yes, science is made up of words too, and numbers have a lot to do with religion. But we need to kind of challenge those of us who are teachers, or those of you who are graduate students planning to be teachers, need to challenge those kinds of assumptions, I think, in our students, because our culture gives us so many quick scripts, quick little phrases to resolve this conflict that, once again, the problem in my mind is that it shuts down thought rather than encouraging deeper thinking. Let's go to you and then...
Hi, I'm Mike Rhoda, and thanks for your talk. I found your discussion of the motivation behind the both-and position interesting. I wondered what you'd think about a complementary or different explanation of the position. How about this? There are many different types of religions, and on at least a few of them, there is no conflict between science and religion. Maybe some of the people expressing that view belong to those religions.
That's true. I suspect, I mean, if we want to leave it in the U.S. context for the time being, that we know from quite a bit of evidence that there's less of this kind of tension in Judaism with science, as there is in some aspects of Christianity. Buddhism is kind of an interesting case in its own right, where there's a lot of complementarity, at least in some people's minds, although other interpretations of Buddhism generate some conflict. Some of us were having a discussion at lunch about whether this conflict would be the same in Islam or not. Once again, if the idea is to push the people in the middle further, so that they don't so easily say, yep, we can have both, then one of the ways to do that is what your question suggests, which is to say, let's learn a little bit more about religion and the way in which different religious traditions have approached the topic. Of course, we need to encourage people to learn more about science, but as I kind of implied in one of my comments about the funding of science, we at least have ways to try to encourage people all the way through elementary school, high school, so forth, college curricula, try to encourage them to say, look, you can't be educated without some knowledge of science. We don't do that with religion. And there are good reasons why we don't require religion in schools. But at a great university like this one, I'm sure there are many opportunities for students who want to learn about religion, and probably students should be encouraged to take more advantage of those opportunities. Yeah.
I think you've partially answered my question, but let me see if I can communicate a little bit about it. You talked about a survey on non-believers and believers and agnostics. Did I get my numbers correctly? 38% were non-believers, 29% were agnostic,
Right.
and 23% were God-oriented. Is that correct?
Yeah, and 8% were sure God exists.
And we're talking about science, a survey on science and religion.
Right.
Okay, so we have a set of 38% and a set of 29% and an in-between set of agnostic.
Right.
And you sort of put it, I'm in the middle. I find myself in that subset. I find myself right a point in the middle, I think, if I'm being good to myself.
Okay.
Now, in line with that, I'd love to know what that survey, how that survey was taken. What was the definition of science? What was the definition of religion? What was the questions that were asked in determining this? Because my posture is that I don't think that any person is totally, whatever you call it, whatever you mean, and it may be a semantical problem, is religious. Any person is totally not an atheist, or there's some degree of agnostic, and where do they grade? And if we're talking about science with being educated people, how do these define?
Yeah, okay. This was a question done last year, about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, by a social scientist named Elaine Eklund. I just mentioned the auspices of the survey, so in case you want to look it up. It was covered, I recall, on MSNBC, and I think maybe in USA Today, and she at the time was teaching at Rice University and currently teaches at SUNY Buffalo. And there are papers now that have come out more than just those early press releases, in case you're interested. The survey itself was conducted among the top-ranked approximately 20 universities, research universities, and among the list of faculty in biology, physics, and chemistry at those universities. Unlike most of the surveys that you read about in the newspaper that maybe have a 15% response rate, this one had a 75% response rate, so it was pretty good in that respect. And it was from lists of people who actually were on the faculty in these departments. So that was how she decided, okay, these people are scientists. Incidentally, she also surveyed people in the social sciences, but I focus on those three science disciplines. It was a web-based survey, so she contacted people, said, would you be willing to answer these questions on a website? They said yes. They filled out these questions. The questions about religion focused, the main one was the one I mentioned, beliefs in God. And there were about 6 or 7 different responses that people could choose from. You're seeing these on your computer screen, so you can choose. And so if you're anywhere in the middle, if you're agnostic, or if some of the other responses were sometimes I do, sometimes I don't believe, or I'm sort of sure but not totally sure. Lots of things in the middle. So those were the options. And some of the other questions, as I mentioned in passing, ask people, well, whether you're religious or not, whether you go to services or not, do you think of yourself as a spiritual person? Now, who knows what that means? And the ones about God are hard enough to figure out. My point in mentioning those numbers that I gave you was just to say, okay, if I'm somebody in Duluth and I'm reading USA Today and I see, wow, only 8% of scientists believe in God, and I know in my community 95% do, I'm going to have a certain view of scientists. I'm going to think, well, they're just not my type. That's it. I should tell you that what she, in fairness to this person who did the study, what she's also done in the last year and a half is gone out to most of the campuses where the survey was conducted and sat down with over, I think, 200 of these people out of something like 1,400 at this point with a tape recorder and just let them talk. And that's really more what she's interested in than these survey results because, as you're pointing out, who knows exactly what people meant when they responded as they did. But I'm just saying, if somebody from the public is reading about these, they're going to gain a certain impression of scientists. Follow? Physics? Biology, chemistry, and physics. Yeah, no, they weren't primarily applied. Right. That's right. Yep. How did they define religion? Right. Yeah. They asked questions. This was not a long survey. The whole thing took about 15 minutes. So they asked some questions about God. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. I'm not sure who is next. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ludger Wiefus. I'm teaching method and theory in religious studies. I was very intrigued that you said that the funding from science was first through major donors, the Medici, etc., and then through the state. And I think it is important then also to think that the sciences were construed through state interests. And I think Peter Gallison's work, etc., can point that the founding of the nation state and the founding of the scientific institution somehow went hand in hand. The flip side of that would be that also what we call modern religion, and from modern Buddhism, as Bechert has shown, to modern Christianity, is also in this co-creation of the nation state. And that makes me then wonder about the multifrenality. And what I see there is actually people in the frames, in their selves, mirroring the Weberian setup of multiple subspheres that somehow have to be negotiated, either in the public sphere or in the sphere of one's own internal conversation. So it doesn't strike me as surprising that people do that, and it doesn't strike me as utterly American, as German. I think, actually there are similar attitudes. It strikes me as very Weberian. So this is what would be precisely to be expected. And that then leads me to the question, yes, it is important to contest this boundary, both the Weberian boundary within and also outside. And I think Hilary Putnam's work nicely shows how ideas, even in the hard sciences, about what counts as a good outcome of an experiment, etc., are related to ideas of human flourishing. So I think that the task of contesting the boundary doesn't stop in pointing out that individuals have these benign Weberian multifrenalities, but rather the question, how does the performance of this conflict itself relate to the creation of the nation state, and what really alternative visions of being religious are there, and how can we get to that theoretically?
Yeah, and I'll take it mostly as a comment. I think you stated it very well, and it's an important point that I agree with. The only thing I might just suggest in reply is that I'm sure you've thought about this more than I have, so I'll just tag it for further consideration. Some of the folks who've come at this question from within the Weberian tradition, of course, then argue that as the current social structure has changed to be less orderly or less organized around this kind of dominant institutional spheres that became part of the modern nation state and becomes more of a globalized society, if you want to use that language, or more of a lateral network organized society. That may then further complicate these understandings of the self, because let's say we don't live in such orderly spheres, if people ever did. We just in the religion sphere, lots of people, of course, identify their religious self by attending some kind of religious congregation, but lots of people don't, and even those who do, some of their religious cues they get from the media, and lots from their friends, and some in the workplace, and so the components of their self may be more fluid and more mixed, and therefore the boundaries among those may be fuzzier than in the past.
That's why I think it's an ideology, right? It's
right.
And that's why maybe a turn to Foucault.
Right. Yes, Foucault would be
helpful to actually look at these.
Yes.
But also to realize that what we think religion is itself is part of this ideological.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. My name is William Peel. I'm a biologist. And I was thinking that one of the big, in a microcosm, university campuses are great instances of compatibilism, because we have schools of science, and we also, on the same campus, we have divinity schools. And I'm not just talking about departments of religion where people study religion as a social science, but whole divinity school where I guess presumably they study aspects of God himself. And in fact, it occurs to me that in Cambridge right now, Harvard is building the largest building ever built in Cambridge. It's a $380 million complex, a big cathedral for the biological sciences. It's butting up right against the divinity school there. In fact, many of the old biology buildings are sitting on borrowed land. It's sort of a long-term lease of divinity school to biology. So it seems like there's almost a point of contact here. To what extent, how do you see the future heading on campuses? Is there a surprising amount of compatibilism, scientists putting up with divinity schools there and vice versa? To what extent are campuses reflective of, in terms of their investment in divinity schools or schools of arts and sciences, how does that reflect on society at large?
Good question. One kind of cynical question or response I sometimes make to those kinds of observations is that, well, what is the $380 billion being spent for? Well, certainly not the divinity school. As I look at my own campus, where the numbers are much smaller, an excellent religion department, which I know from a distance being in the sociology department, but religion department is regarded as kind of like the classics department. Something you ought to have. Don't spend very much money on it. Don't hire many people. Don't encourage many students to be involved, but have it. Well, you're right. That is one way to have kind of compatibilism on campus. And I sometimes point that out to students. And one of the ways they they may, as freshmen or sophomores, manage these multiple identities that they've been exposed to is simply by going to different buildings to be different people. So they trot over to the humanities building and study religion, and they'll trot over to the engineering quad and learn engineering. And it's not clear that they ever kind of make the connection as they walk down the sidewalk from one to the other. At my campus, I'm in the business of trying to mess that up. So besides being in the sociology department, I run this thing called the Center for the Study of Religion that tries to get people from the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences and every place else to interact and not to major in religion or to become religion scholars necessarily, but within their own disciplines to think about it a little bit. So for instance, in about a month, we're having a symposium on neuroscience and religion, and have people who do brain imaging come and talk with people who do philosophy of science, and let them duke it out a bit and see what they have to say to each other. That certainly can't substitute for the deep knowledge that has to occur within disciplines, but I think it is a kind of layer of the educational experience that's valuable. Yep.
I'm Robert Wyman from biology. So we continue the Harvard story. The story I was told when I was there, many times I heard it, I'm not sure it's true, is that at the same time, probably the previous questioner was talking about, Harvard was building its first accelerator. And it just happened to be near the science campus there. It just happened to be angled so that the outport was directed at the biology buildings. Of course, biologists said, no. What to do? We'll just tilt it a few degrees toward the divinity school. They won't know. So Harvard's one icon, the New York Times is another, and the New York Times has been following this debate moderately, and every so often they even quote from some of the creationists, especially that are interesting. And I've been sort of paying attention to what the creationists actually say, which is what many people in this debate don't do. And one of the quotes was, a couple of the quotes were really quite remarkable. So one was a debate between creationists and Darwinians. And they interviewed, I think, a minister coming out of this debate, and he was just angry as heck. And he says, the whole purpose of this debate is to come closer to God, and we didn't make any progress on that. That's a short quote. Another one, they quote a minister going to one of these meetings, and then going on Sunday to his congregation and giving sort of a report of it. And he says to his congregation, I heard really interesting things, and it's very clear to me now that the choice is really simple. The scientists are saying that Earth is a rock in a cold, black universe, and some zillions of years ago, some slime sort of woke up and slithered around, and after a lot of generations, it became a monkey, and then you, and there is no God, and when you die, the worms eat you again. And, you can believe that. And he says, on the other hand, you can believe that there's a God in heaven, and he loves you, and he created this Garden of Eden of an earth for you, and created you in his image, and gave his only begotten Son to save you, and loves you, and will forgive you, and take you up to heaven, etc. And he would say, you have a choice. You can believe A, or you can believe B. And if you read through a lot of these quotes, what comes strongly through to me anyway, is that truth, at least truth as scientists understand it, is the utter irrelevance to people who are deeply religious. That is not the issue. And so when scientists talk to them, and I think this is part of the answer to your question, their shit's totally crossing in the night. Scientists go and they go to these debates, and I must admit, I came here to find out, is there anything new on the truth issue? And scientists come to these things and try to say, well, what we say is true, and what you say is sort of dream up or fantasy or something like that. And and then of course several paragraphs later, the scientist comes and says, well, of course, we don't have truth. All we have is really falsifiability. And all that we can say is, well, what we currently believe fits with the evidence. So, of course, the religious people go away and say, all right, you don't even know whether what you're saying is true or not. So how can you say what we're saying is not true? And what I'm saying, I think something you left out, and one of the reasons I think that people might be able to encompass both of these things easily at the same time is that all of us carry around very, very different and contradictory ideas of truth. I do this with a science for non-scientists class. I just ask the kids on the first day to define truth. And half of them come up with it's conventional, it's by definition, it's what everybody accepts, and the others it's demonstrable by experiment, et cetera, that there's sort of a unique truth or there's kind of a conventional truth. And almost all of us use the word truth in at least those two senses at different times in our conversation. And I think most humans everywhere do that, and therefore scientific truth is in one pot. Mm-hmm. And although we use the same word, it has an opposite meaning. Religious truth is in some other pot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Professor Wuthnow, I'm Leo Hickey. I'm part of the Geology and Geophysics Department. And here we go, and I think your talk was a bit paradoxical because we've billed this as a discussion of the conflict between science and religion. And if I were to fly over your talk at about 15,000 feet, I might think that there was virtually no conflict among the general population. And I, just to stir things up a bit and maybe continue a bit from where Bob left off, I think that's probably not true. And it really, in a way, doesn't matter what the general population thinks. Somebody here mentioned the fact that there was Western science, and as if there was an Eastern science. Science is a profoundly Western operation that has been transplanted around the world. It's a universal, a human operation now, which all of us do as well, but it originally and in its genesis was a Western operation. It profoundly was a product of Judeo-Christian Hellenistic tradition, which looked at progressiveness and progressivity. And in fact, I often tell my students that Western civilization and the Enlightenment was the only time in which fossils, which are the rock record of past life, were the realization that these things were once living life forms. This is the only civilization which ever realized that, except for the Greeks, who had a bit of a dim glimmer of this. And the point here is that science itself has been a process over the years which has displaced the centrality of the human-divine relationship gradually and has put that aside. It has really engendered profound questions, as Bob mentioned, about the meaning of human life and human beings. And these questions have disturbed those who think deeply about them. And the shockwaves of this have visited themselves upon the population as a whole. And we now have a progressivist view and an evidentiary view that was not shared by my religious compatriots 6 centuries ago and with religion in general. So I think there is a conflict. It isn't necessarily resolvable. And I think one of the things we have to do is see where some of the profound lessons for human being and for the seeking of truth come out of this in the end. But I do want to emphasize that I did think that perhaps taking a sort of a general average sociological view might not really, I think there is a conflict. And it's quite apparent that from the very beginning of the adoption of the evolutionary paradigm, those like Thomas Huxley were quite aware of the sociological implications of this and were using science and the scientific view as a weapon against the established religious and hierarchical framework that they found themselves in. And this has continued to this day, and it is a cause of considerable uneasiness on the part of the social structure, those who arbitrate the social mores, as well as the religious establishment. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Your comment reminds me or makes me think that maybe I did a better job in the second half of my talk than in the first half, because the first half of my talk was basically to say what you said very eloquently. Yes, there are good reasons for conflict here. And you've mentioned some of the scientific or epistemological reasons, which I mentioned just in passing. I also tried to emphasize even some within our institutions and the way we live our lives. Yeah, and you look at all of those things, you sort of look at these both-and people and say, it's just more complicated than that. There really ought to be more conflict than we see, even. So I think I'm agreeing with you. Evan.
Hi, my name is Evan Baer, and I'm a student at the Divinity School. And I'd be very curious to hear if you've looked at the growth of Christian worldview education and looked at, or for example, what do you know about what churches, for example, are doing to help the members of their church think through questions of science? I know in areas of vocation and economy, even some international human rights and missions kind of work that's happening among churches. Are churches at all trying to bridge the gap to science? Are there Christian authors who are writing on these subjects that's penetrating? I would just think of, if Rick Warren wrote a book on science, it would have a huge impact on how mainstream America thinks about issues of science.
I think that's something that needs to be done, desperately needs to happen, but isn't happening very much yet. There are probably things I don't know about, especially at the grassroots, but as I look at the literature being produced, kind of from the religion side or the theology side, kind of broad religion and science engagement, you see some of the same names over and over and over again, and you look at the latest book and it looks an awful lot like the previous book, or in fact the 10 before that, and the science that's being cited usually isn't anything since 1980, if then, which makes me think, yes, there's room for people who know the science well enough and have enough understanding of religion or theology or however they frame it to deal with it from that side. But it's not happening, and I don't see it happening very much in congregations. Christian congregations is the ones I have in mind. There are a few. I happen to belong to one that, because it's literally, the one I'm talking about, literally on the Princeton campus, it's able to bring over scientists and historians of science and so forth to give lectures and to have discussions. That's one of the places where this kind of discussion can happen, but there just aren't many places that have the kind of resources to really do it well. And you mentioned Rick Warren. That would be great if somebody who has the audience. This is the Purpose-Driven Life author, 25 million copies or so. Somebody who has an audience like that could do that, and probably could because he has all the staff and the huge church, and undoubtedly has scientists who go to his church, knows his church, and so forth. I doubt if that's going to happen in his case. Why not? One of the things that's happening in the kind of larger world of religion with the clergy who have influence is that they are so driven by numbers, drawing in large numbers of people, building up big congregations, having a television ministry, or in the best of cases, as in Rick Warren, spending a lot of their time helping Rwanda rebuild itself, laudably. But the average congregation doesn't have much of a kind of built-in incentive to deal with these questions. So I think the places where these discussions are going to happen, certainly going to happen on campuses if they happen at all. Hopefully they'll also happen on divinity school campuses and seminary campuses. And in the best situations, they're going to happen in the world of journalism or on television or on NPR or whatever it may be. I think as in so many issues, unfortunately, this is just one of the big issues that we're dealing with in our society, but as with so many of them, and maybe because we're bombarded with lots of different things to think about and worry about, it's just so easy to kind of brush off this topic and say, oh yeah, a little science, a little religion, that's fine with me, and not go any deeper. We are out of time, am I right? We should take a break. I'll be around if you have other questions. Thank you.